Hello and welcome to a new week of Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that, as you know, gives you everything you need to know about British politics in less than 20 minutes.
It's Monday, November the 25th, and it's the week MPs decide on assisted dying, that the Prime Minister interviews for his new Cabinet Secretary, and the week the government rolls out the first draft of its welfare plans to stop the welfare bill ballooning. And we'll be here every day to take you through it.
My name is Jack Blanchard of Politico. With me, as you can hear, Sam Coates of Sky News. Neither of us are out of the country this week. I am in my house. Sam Coates is in his house. The Prime Minister is in his house. A rare treat for all of us. Sam, just before we get started, Politico had a sort of drinks reception at the end of last week for the new parliamentary researchers who started work in Parliament since the election, and it was a delight to meet so many of them who love listening to Politics at Jack and Sam's in the morning. I did a straw poll of these are all very young people, like half our age, who listen to it in the morning. Guess how many of them listen to this podcast at double speed? Exactly zero. None of them. Everyone I met from Gen Z who listens to this podcast is like, what? Weird old people listen to podcasts at double speed. This is a phenomenon I can reveal is purely down to like middle-aged parents who probably got far too little time on their hands. But yeah, all our younger listeners are listening to you at normal speed this morning, I'm happy to say.
Thoughts and prayers for spending so long with us. I listen to all my podcasts at double speed, I have to say.
See, middle-aged dad syndrome, busy dads.
It means you can get more in. Okay, well, shall we trot through the week and everything that's coming up ahead? Today, the big moment we're going to be talking about in a moment is the CBI conference in central London. Big warnings from business about the impact of the budget. Rachel Reeves is going to step into the lion's den and explain her thinking to business leaders there. There are going to be tributes to John Prescott, who died last week in Parliament. Keir Starmer is hosting a roundtable in Number 10 on drink spiking, and they're thinking of introducing further legislation to crack down on that.
OK, tomorrow, Cabinet meets as usual. The government is publishing its welfare white paper. That will be the big story of the day. Many of you will have seen Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary, out and about on Sunday talking about that. And Jonathan Reynolds, the Business Secretary, he'll be making his first appearance before the Business and Trade Select Committee on Tuesday afternoon.
Wednesday's Prime Minister's Questions with Keir Starmer back in the saddle, and David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, is before the Foreign Affairs Committee. There's a hell of a lot to ask him about.
There certainly is. Thursday, we're getting new migration statistics, and then all eyes will be on the public inquiry into Salisbury, the poisonings in Salisbury. If you remember that from 10 years ago, there'll be FCO, Foreign Office officials appearing before that on Thursday, talking about the possibility, heaven forbid, of Russian involvement in that chemical weapons attack.
And then Friday is the biggest political moment of the week. That's the End of Life Bill, as it is known, Kim Leadbeater's Private Members Bill. It's what's known as the second reading debate, which is the sort of vote on the overall principles of that legislation after a 5-hour debate. So a huge moment for MPs who've got to make up their mind by the end of that. But it is also the Irish elections, which look like they're on a knife edge with developments over the last 72 hours, possibly swaying things against the incumbent government.
Yeah, Simon Harris, the Taoiseach, having a bad weekend of it, and that there's like 3 different parties all on almost exactly the same proportion of votes over there, so that's going to be really interesting. Before we get into it, Sam, we should also mention the election in Romania last night. I'm not a massive ardent follower of Romanian politics, I have to admit, but it's a really big shock result. An ultra-nationalist right-wing candidate, whose name I'll probably mispronounce, but is something like Calin Georgescu, finishing top of the poll to be president of Romania, absolutely out of nowhere. Nobody saw this coming at all. They were expecting this guy to finish 5th or 6th. There is going to be a final runoff, but he is like an ultra hard right pro-Putin candidate. Already people sort of muttering darkly about Russian involvement in the election, although I don't think any of that's been proven yet, but definitely one to watch as you consider the way that the political sands are shifting in Europe at the moment. This is another signal of where the world appears to be heading.
Complication for those EU debates over where to go next and how to handle the evolving global political situation. Let's bring it back home first of all. There are big warnings leading all of the papers and prominent in all the bulletins this morning from the head of the CBI, Ray Newton-Smith, about the consequences of the budget. They've done a big survey of their members suggesting that half of employers are now looking at cutting jobs since Rachel Reeves' biggest measure in the budget was a £25 billion increase in national insurance contributions from employers. According to their survey, basically just under 50% said that they would reduce the current headcount, i.e. get rid of staff or not fill positions. 62% said they would reduce the number of recruits, and 46% said they'd delay or temporarily reduce pay rises as a consequence. This is yet another kind of warning from business. We've had a lot of them. Lots of different groupings have been writing letters furiously over the last 3 weeks or so since Rachel Reeves' budget to say that there is a real world impact and a real world hit to growth from what the budget, the decisions in the budget, and she is going to stand up and basically say there was no alternative. There was nothing else I can do. Essentially, you're going to have to suck it up.
Yeah, fascinating. This is some comments that seem to have been briefed to The Guardian that Rachel Reeves, although it hasn't officially been confirmed she'll be speaking at the CBI, according to their website. There's a senior cabinet minister. Everyone's expecting it to be Rachel Reeves, obviously. Guardian seems to have some of the words she's going to say or expected to say. I have heard lots of responses to the government's first budget, but I have heard no alternatives. That is real echoes of Maggie Thatcher, isn't it, Sam? You know, that whole there is no alternative thing that Thatcher got associated with in the early 1980s. Rachel Reeves appearing to embrace that Iron Lady theme. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? We spent months, probably years, watching Rachel Reeves as Shadow Chancellor going to the CBI conference and having all these breakfasts with business leaders in the city, very famously wooing them over smoked salmon and like convincing business that Labour wasn't going to be a problem for them, and did a pretty good job. And by the time we got to the election, Labour was making a fairly convincing case that we are now the party of business. The CEOs were all flocking to the Labour business days at Labour conference. They'd managed to tell a pretty good game that in fact Tory government had brought chaos, as they put it, to the business sector, and it was Labour that was going to bring stability, and that actually most businesses wanted a Labour government now because they could see a big Labour win at the election would give that a more stable environment for business to operate. And then a few months in, they come in and clobber business with this tax, and now business is absolutely up in arms, and we have the more traditional scene of a Labour Chancellor sort of wandering into the CBI conference and getting shouted at and booed for most of the day, which is probably what's going to happen today.
I do think it's easier to claim the mantle of being an Iron Lady, which is what Rachel Reeves is clearly wanting to happen today, if you hadn't ended up doing something very different to what you promised in the election campaign during all those breakfasts. If you remember, the key argument from Labour about why you should trust them was that they were not going to come in to power and to tax a lot and to borrow a lot in order to spend a lot at their first budget. That was literally their promise all the way through. And that is exactly what Rachel Reeves has ended up doing. She's taken taxes to what she says are pretty much a high. She will tell them, she will tell the CBI today that she does not plan to have another budget like this. I have wiped the slate clean. Clearly, the markets are on her back now. There's been that rise in borrowing immediately after the budget, meaning that she can't borrow a lot more. So she has maxed out the government credit card. You know, if she's the Iron Lady, it's a sort of inconsistent persona to the one that she presented the electorate with and the budget with during the run-up to the election. Just as a year ago she said she wouldn't change the rules on debt and fiscal rules. She's changed that as well. So the sort of Iron Lady case just is a little bit harder to make given the flip-flopping that you've had this year. I
think, though, that on the bigger picture, you know, Labour decided to make this a big increase in national insurance contributions from employers. It does raise an awful lot of money, this one. This was a big tax change that will make a big difference to the public finances. Labour obviously spending the money, they say, on steadying the ship, pouring money into the NHS. But whether or not that's a good idea, it is a big, significant move. I would contrast that with the change to inheritance tax, which has also kicked up a huge storm. As you know, we saw all the farmers protesting in Westminster last week. That continues to continues to be something the opposition make hay with, if I can make an absolutely appalling pun. Sorry about that at this time of the morning. But it's another thing that's creating an almost equal amount of noise, and yet the changes to inheritance tax raise a whopping like £500 million a year or something. And there must be people inside the Labour Party looking at that one going, is it really worth it? Is it really worth picking a fight with this big, noisy sector that's clearly going to run and run and run? This grievance is going to be held against Labour for years. That, to me, has a sort of elements of the pasty tax thing from 2012, where you make little tweaks to tax changes that raise small amounts of money and cause an enormous stir and cause you a big political problem. At least with the Nix change that the CBI are upset about today, it is a big, significant move that is fundamentally changing how much money Rachel Reeves has to play with. And there'll be plenty of people in her Treasury team who think, in the end, we had to do something big. We decided it would be this one. And, we are getting benefits from that as well as all the noisy pushback.
But there is a consequence, and there's a consequence both for the economy and there's a consequence for politics. We saw on Friday one of those surveys of what's called purchasing managers, people who've got to make spending decisions in business. And overall, there is now projected to be a sort of contraction rather than an expansion in business activity next year. If that plays out, that is bad for a government that has put growth at the top of its priority. In particular, it's the services sector, which is so big in the UK, that is contracting rather than expanding. That is bad for a government that puts growth so high on its agenda. The political consequence is sort of inescapable, given that Keir Starmer said that growth is his number one mission, and the target for his number one mission is, if I could remember you, this is in all the documents that were published pre-election, the highest sustained growth in the G7. Now, we're miles off achieving that target. And as it currently stands, the US is way out in front. That doesn't look like it's going to change unless something absolutely spectacular happens. Therefore, Labour is on course to miss its biggest, most important, number one numerical target it set itself. What is it going to do? Well, I understand that change is coming on this front. Either before Christmas or maybe just after Christmas, Keir Starmer is going to give a speech where, guess what? He refines some of the missions, or at least he gives supplementary new targets. He's been sort of doing some of this revising all the way along. But the debate inside government is what they do about this pretty much unachievable target about the G7 being the fastest growth, sustained growth in the G7, because it's for the birds, and some of them now admit that. And I understand that there is talk now of actually, in light of the Donald Trump victory and how inflation played a part in that, and how actually what matters is the pound in people's pocket, essentially making the main economic target that they talk about something to do with disposable income. So there is a look at whether or not you can say that disposable income was higher over the course of the Parliament, or some such target, which they hope will be more reflexive of how people are feeling about themselves after, for instance, the minimum wage raise, which is also something the business is complaining about, and a slightly higher raise in some of the benefit payments, and raises to tax credits. Things like that might mean that people feel better off at the end of the Parliament. So now this government, within weeks, is looking to set a specific target that better reflects the fact that outcome might be much more achievable. So keep an eye out for that.
That is properly interesting. I mean, you can make a perfectly reasonable case as to why, disposable income is a better measure for most people's day-to-day lives than some, ephemeral, GDP target that they're set. But it just comes back to the question: you make all these promises before an election. Are we expecting to hold our governments to account on them or not? Keir Starmer, of course, has a track record on that, made all those false promises to Labour members before he became Labour leader, and then junked all them and just went in a completely different direction. And that worked out pretty well for him. So maybe this will as well. I don't know, but there's certainly an honesty and a trust thing there that people may hold against him when it comes to the election, or maybe they won't care at all. We shall see. The big thing, as we said earlier, Sam, tomorrow is going to be the government making announcements about welfare reform, and that feels to me like, in a way, an easier message for them to sell, at least to the public and the papers that drive so much of the narrative. There's going to be a clampdown on who they're paying welfare to. They're big drive to try and get people back to work. This is, of course, part of the project to improve the economic situation, to save the government money, but it will definitely garner some more popular headlines in the right-wing press, as it did yesterday when the Mail on Sunday actually gave Keir Starmer a friendly front-page splash for the first time ever in history. The flip side of that, of course, is there will be plenty of Labour MPs who don't like what is being announced tomorrow, and they will be kicking off instead. But I sort of feel like Keir Starmer is in a happier place with that than he is with the upsetting the business with the Nix rises as we're seeing today.
Yes, but bear in mind that tomorrow is just a white paper. It's a draft. It's a very early stage set of proposals, and they've ended up being able to come up with a proposal for basically 18 to 21-year-olds. Liz Kendall confirmed that on Sky yesterday and said that 18 to 21-year-olds who are not in training, work or studying will face some kind of benefit sanctions. But the really big one, which is reforms to sickness benefit, well, I'm not sure we're going to get a lot on that. That's complicated. It, as you say, it always causes problems with Labour MPs. And it's the bit of the bill that has absolutely exploded from £17 billion a year from before the pandemic to £35.5 billion projected by the end of the decade. That's the biggie. And I'm not sure how much we're going to get on the most complicated bit. So, yes, some good headlines, but the really heavy lifting bit, not sure there's a great deal of detail.
Let's just talk quickly about assisted dying, Sam, because whatever the government does this week, nothing is going to be bigger than the thing that the backbenchers are bringing forward on Friday, which is this private members bill that could be the biggest, most radical change to British social law in a very long time, decades probably. Kim Levitt, the Labour MP, bringing forward a bill on Friday when we have that crucial second reading vote. MPs today are going to get a very big public opinion briefing on this from the More in Common think tank, who've produced a 70-page research document after surveying something like 17,000 people. And there's an online briefing that MPs, again, in fact, anyone can tune into if they want to at 10 o'clock this morning. We know the public are broadly in favour of this, although basically pretty sceptical about how well the NHS is going to be able to deliver it. That seems to basically be where we're at. MPs are slowly coming out on one side or the other. I think we know something like half of how MPs publicly have said they're going to vote now. We've got someone's, the I newspaper has been keeping a tally, a couple of hundred in favour, about 140 against. That leaves about half of MPs who've not publicly said which way they're going to vote. And so we still don't know, Sam, which way this vote is going to go. Seeing high-profile people coming out on either side of the debate, and I would imagine that's going to continue happening through the week. Those in favour of this bill think they've got the numbers to win. They still think they've got the numbers to win, even though that the argument has sort of publicly swung against them a little bit over the past week or two, particularly with the Health Secretary and then at the weekend the Justice Secretary both coming out against it. But they still say they think that overall they've got the backbench MPs they need to win the vote on Friday. The truth is, nobody really knows for sure.
Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, was out and about outlining the reasons for her opposition at the weekend, saying she was profoundly concerned about the legislation, not just for religious reasons, but because she's uncomfortable with the state becoming involved in helping people to die. That caused quite an ugly spat with Lord Faulkner, former Shadow Justice Secretary under Keir Starmer, who said, I think she's wrong, I think she's motivated, and I respect this by her religious beliefs, but they shouldn't be imposed on everybody else. I think there was some discomfort at the way Charlie Faulkner was hitting back at Shabana Mahmood. But there's just one thing I want to add, which is, at the moment, this is all the project of a private members bill, Ken Leadbeater's legislation that is before Parliament. If this bill progresses after Friday, it really does, I understand it, basically become the government's problem. Because it's at that point, if it passes, that the government has to do its impact assessment. That's something we told you last week. But really, that means the government has to spell out how the whole thing would work. Is it an NHS service? How does the court system, which is in part quite uncomfortable about what's heading to high courts, which are already very stretched, actually operationalise the authorising of people who want to take their own life? All of these things become a massive government problem, in addition to the sort of cabinet split over it all. I was talking to one person close to number 10 last week who was saying basically this sort of becomes a government bill next year, which means it sucks the oxygen out of government business and means it will dominate completely as it continues to go through the Commons and both houses of Parliament, which some of them, as we said last week, are deeply uncomfortable about.
Some of them are, although others are quite pleased that the government is actually pushing forward, or sort of tacitly pushing forward, with some big social reform and say, what are we in government for? If you believe in this stuff, we should be getting change. And it brings you back to those Labour MPs who I still find are bleating, Sam, about having to make this big decision so early into being an MP, to which I say, that's why you stood to be an MP, guys. You could have stayed at your think tank if you didn't want to make big decisions. Get on with it and make your mind up. Okay, we're running out of time. We better stop there. Sam, have a wonderful day. I will look forward to seeing you again on Tuesday morning.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.